I did something at one point in time. I wrote something. Now, when I wrote this, they had triggered some gene on me. There's some gene indicator I have where I'm a red man. My red man has a particular way of being. It's actually pretty similar to the way I was before I said no to the women's recruitment effort at the University of Chicago, and then all of a sudden I was no longer allowed to be a woman, and I was no longer allowed to have the kind of racial profile I did. Somehow he became a red man, and that red man had a particular political philosophy and a particular political capital. My understanding is he was allowed to at some point practice law. I wrote something, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it was part of an affidavit that I submitted in Spanish to the Supreme Court of Texas. Now, there is no electronic record of me submitting that affidavit in Spanish. I submitted it in both English and Spanish. I didn't use Google Translate. I didn't ask anybody else to translate. May it have had some grammatical errors? Probably. But it was 100% authentic, mine, and I submitted it in Spanish along with the English one. Somebody took the Spanish one and hooked it up to the Army retirement system. I know, I caught them at the time. I have all the documents I need to prove it. But somewhere on some current, somebody keeps trying to tell me, well, it's different in Spanish. We do it differently. No, you don't do it differently. I know Spanish well enough. I'll read this in English. Why we need to stop communism in Texas. There is currently an unconstitutional effort afoot in Texas in violation of Section 557.021 of the Texas Government Code. It has been effectuated through the Health and Human Services system to obstruct people's development and self-sufficiency through gainful employment and access to opportunities to acquire and hold personal assets for future investment. Rather than providing monetary compensation at a taxable and verifiable wage rate, individual skills, talents, efforts, and ideas have been funneled to a predetermined, centrally programmed plan for a manufactured, collectivized economy. This economic model intentionally destroys the individual impetus behind personal choice and initiative and subsumes individuals and families into the nexus of national debt. Our personal contributions, efforts, and excellence are not nurtured to create a responsible citizenry, but are rather manipulated out of us and into a big pile of stolen American dreams. This pile is then divided against itself as a form of competitive sporting event that bankers and lawyers, both in and out of government, use as their personal and individual wealth and assets. Dissenters are people who refuse to get with the program are punished. This punishment is violent on many levels. It is violent in that it divests individuals of property and living accommodations. It is violent in that it can and does mandate confinement in institutional settings for observation as part of human test subject experimentation, including the application of behavioral science techniques intended to test responses to different forms of psychological pressure. It is physically violent in that it mandates consumption and ingestion of controlled substances that literally alter body and brain chemistry as various behavioral science techniques are being applied to test for their effectiveness. It is also violent in that it threatens to return people who have entered the system to escape physical or psychological violence to the very violent circumstances they are attempting to escape unless they comply with subjection to the experimental regime. One of the most nefarious applications of the effort involves mental illness designations that label people as lacking in credibility, coded to be perpetually at the mercy of someone else's assessment of their stability, and pressured into consuming drugs at the whims of members of the bureaucratic apparatus. Prescription drug abuse is an epidemic in the U.S., and not just because of overuse by the so-called consumer. There is an epidemic of party operators from both the Democratic and Republican parties profiting off of the abuse of privilege doctors and psychiatrists have in their prescription of controlled substances. Behavior modification and manipulation programs are being tested in places where people are most vulnerable, like homeless and domestic violence shelters and hospitals, without attendant, acute, or critical care of psychological or emotional trauma. This amounts to a form of mind control effectuated through deliberate emotional stressors coupled with punitive measures for unsatisfactory reactions. Those who attempt to protest or even question are threatened with eviction or worse unless they agree to take drugs. Mothers are told they cannot keep their children with them unless they agree to keep them drugged. And young people are going to school increasingly channeled into medical assistance programs where their primary job is to make sure people, including children, take drugs. It is a form of sabotage under Section 557-011 of the Texas Government Code, in that it intentionally seeks to coerce American civil society into a sense of docility to tyranny at high levels in disregard of the law. It intentionally tries to cow people into accepting drugs as a reaction to challenging those who break the law and ceding sovereignty to entities using drugs as a replacement for actual material support. It intentionally orchestrates and sustains an economic model that profits a few bureaucrats by divesting large numbers of people of their personal and private property, or hindering them from being able to acquire personal or private property without obligating it to public indebtedness or indenture, in violation of Article 1, Section 17 of the Texas Constitution. Due to other areas of its operationalization, it is in effect a form of communism, seeking to destroy and replace the American democratic process, and is thus also illegal in Texas, per Section 557.021 of the Texas Government Code, Subchapter C, Definitions. This is not a race war, as it is often portrayed, but that the majority of faces you see are black or brown or other people of color is no coincidence. These communists trying to command the economy need race-based reasons to create social dissension, unrest, and public protest by pitting different groups against each other based on race to justify economic policies that profit off our imposed poverty. Demographic information collected for reporting as part of the systemization of the impoverishment assigns different valuations to different demographic indicators and plays on racial and ethnic stereotypes in marketing of its services to do things from constructing illnesses in certain communities to rationing resources to others. These are specifically economically motivated factors that are then coded into people who are then moved like commodities through one part of the system to another, while private funder networks or venture capitalists attached to the system move their money literally through people's bodies. The drugs help to dull the pain and reduce the level of consciousness one has to these processes, but it is also intentionally altering brain chemistry so as to make it more compliant with the mandates of the regime and efficient in its completion of whatever transactions it has been assigned to perform. I'm going to stop because I know now at some point somebody got into this and again turned it into a program. So let me revise that sentence for you. I'm going to edit your gene modification program right now. The drugs are irrelevant. We have the capacity to modulate and modify our own brain chemistry, and being compliant with illegal mandates is not sustainable. Any regime that attempts to masquerade it as efficiency deserves to be destroyed. Return to the text as written. Thus, these communists need women with children to be victims of homelessness or violence. They need broken military veterans with maladies exacerbated by realizing the terms of their service and reasons for serving were mere propaganda used by communists within their own country to get them to kill someone else and another for profit. The communists promote lies and deception, and any who see it are either forced to lie along with them or are punished with poverty. These were the sorts of things that the U.S. supposedly spent most of the 20th century fighting against. It was the spirit of resistance to these methods of social control over people that was supposed to fuel our economy and social stability, which included labor rights, civil rights, women's rights, gay and lesbian rights, and religious diversity, as well as technological innovation and the flourishing of the arts and entertainment sectors in the U.S. It was these things that were supposed to be what Americans promoted when we went abroad or offered when people from other countries came here. The U.S. was supposed to be the spirit that tore down walls, literally. But that's not what we have here now. When the Soviet Union collapsed, that was not the end of communism. This communism is not the economic model proposed by scientific economic visionaries who saw that capitalism would eventually compel the evolution of consciousness in people, seeing that their own self-interest was in owning the means of production rather than settling for someone else to own it. It is not in resistance to cutthroat capitalism degrading people that instead aspires to give to each according to their need and receive from each according to their capabilities. In this form of communism, deception is used to rob the people and increase the wealth of oligarchs and people they like, while more and more people are orchestrated into poverty. The main tenets of this communism include a centrally planned economy replete with economic directives intended to unilaterally guide economic development policy, often in subversion of legislative process or the Constitution. and undermining a democratic participation by citizens insofar as individuals permitted to enter elections and obtain elected office enact laws that are in actuality unconstitutional and serve to undermine the democratic participation of citizens in a constitutional republican form of government. Mind control techniques and deception used to effect social control as sanctioned by executive directives, legislation, and local policy implementation. Commandeering of individuals' personal property through contrived economic events that assure that financial means and timelines connected to fulfillment of obligations are incapable of being met. In violation of constitutional provisions concerning perpetuities, such as Article 1, Section 26 of the Texas Constitution. Simulation of legal process in violation of the Texas Code of Military Justice in order to undermine the readiness and influence the loyalty and morale of members of the U.S. military and other first responders who would be called upon to assist civilians in the event of a national security or natural disaster scenario. Limited access to means by which to acquire personal wealth or assets for future development without obligating individuals to more public indebtedness or indenture. There's more to this. I wrote this in the spring of 2017. What do you see going on now? Do you want to call that revolution? Do you want to call that a people's movement? Because that's not what it is. This is communism, and it's the worst kind of communism. See, the problem is that the Federal Reserve the Federal Reserve Bank of America did two major things in the last 5 years. A, they made an agreement with some group to allow women to engage acts of prostitution in a progressively normalizing manner so as to effectuate a form of biocurrency using a sexual energy under the auspices of energy, and at the same time giving them a political advantage that came at the cost of the rest of us being colonized under their whim. And secondly, they also manipulated data around labor in this country. They started an index in order to track labor data with certain benchmarks, and then they strategically disengaged it 3 years ago. They disengaged it in enough time to take what data they had accumulated, correlate it into some sort of algorithmic program that correlated with policy changes at the Federal Reserve level in order to pretend like the bourgeoisie is the working class and the rest of us are the tyrannical business owners that are responsible for bankrupting the world. And unless you've curried political favor by showing fealty and licking the fucking boot or the fucking toe of some jackass that was able to lie their way into a political position, then somehow it's your fault. Every fucking night, you get the dump. Every fucking night, you have to pay somebody for something they did. This isn't even just communism. This is a communist fetish show. It needs to be shut down.